At dawn in 1683, Vienna burned in ruins, unaware that the fate of the world would be decided there. Surrounded after months of siege, the city endured hunger, fear, and a hope that was almost extinguished. Before it stood a colossal army, waiting only for the final order to crush everything. Silent cannons, confident soldiers, and leaders certain of an inevitable victory. What no one could see was the force moving far beyond the shattered walls. For weeks, the constant thunder of cannons set the rhythm of agony. Each impact tore away stone, lives, and certainty. Inside the city, exhausted defenders slept among rubble, waking only to fight again. The air reeked of gunpowder and death. Still, Vienna did not fall. Each day held was not heroism but necessity. Buying time became the only possible strategy. In the enemy camp, confidence bordered on arrogance. Numerical superiority seemed enough to win without haste. That belief bred carelessness. As the siege dragged on, critical decisions were delayed and opportunities wasted. What should have been a swift blow turned into a dangerous weight. Without realizing it, the enemy allowed something far more lethal than walls to take shape. Far away, messengers crossed forests, rivers, and hostile lands. Rival kings, wary generals, and fragmented armies began to align. Not by friendship, but by survival. The threat was no longer local. If Vienna fell, nothing would stop the advance. What emerged was not merely a relief force, but a desperate and calculated response. Every step of that force was planned with precision. The goal was not immediate confrontation, but the perfect scenario. Terrain, timing, and enemy behavior were observed with cold attention. Victory would depend not on numbers, but on impact. The decisive weapon had to remain invisible until the final moment, protected from impatience and human error. When the armies finally drew near, the battlefield had already been decided in silence. One side believed it controlled the fight, the other waited only for the right moment to destroy it. Nothing would unfold gradually. The outcome would come fast, violent, and final, turning confidence into panic and changing history in a matter of hours. At that stage, the war was no longer just about capturing a city. It had become a silent contest of intelligence and patience. While the siege followed its predictable course, something far more dangerous matured beyond enemy sight. Every hour of delay strengthened those who seemed weaker. The balance slowly began to shift unnoticed. The attacking command ignored clear warning signs. Reports were dismissed, alerts treated as exaggeration. Certainty of victory dulled the perception of risk. Troops remained focused on the walls, while the real danger approached from the hills. In prolonged wars, the most common mistake is not lack of strength, but failure to see beyond the original plan. On the opposite side, movement was silent and disciplined. Men marched in restrained formations, avoiding unnecessary clashes. The objective was not to announce presence, but to preserve surprise. Every decision was made with absolute coldness. There was no room for impulse. That force advanced not to fight, but to choose the exact moment to destroy. The terrain became a decisive ally. Gentle hills, open fields, and long slopes were studied as parts of an invisible weapon. Nothing was left to chance. Where many saw only landscape, commanders saw speed, impact, and advantage. The battle would be won not only by men, but by how space itself would be used. Inside Vienna, resistance took on a new meaning. Every wall still standing represented precious hours gained. The defenders no longer fought expecting victory, but believing in the arrival of something greater. Exhaustion was extreme, yet surrender was dismissed. They did not know when or how, but they felt the outcome drawing near. In the enemy camp, pressure began to seep in. Fatigued troops stretched supply lines, and dispersed vigilance weakened cohesion. Psychological advantage started to reverse. Absolute confidence gave way to isolated doubts. Small failures appeared, barely noticeable, yet enough to compromise an entire structure. The fatal decision came when the siege was maintained at all costs. Dividing forces looked safe on paper, but in reality created dangerous gaps. The enemy believed it controlled multiple fronts when it was actually spreading itself thin. At that moment, defeat ceased to be a possibility and became an inevitable consequence. On the Allied side, the waiting continued. No premature moves, no unnecessary display. Patience was the true discipline. The plan required the enemy to be fully committed, without reserves or room to adapt. Victory would not be built through persistence, but through a single concentrated and irreversible blow. When the forces finally took position, the difference between them was invisible to ordinary eyes. One army was prepared to resist, the other to break through. It was not about pushing lines slowly, but shattering them at a specific point. The entire campaign converged on that silent instant before absolute violence. At that moment, the fate of the battle was already sealed, though few realized it. The stage was set for one of the most decisive clashes in military history. Everything depended on seconds, slope, and speed. Once the order was given, there would be no retreat, only collapse. The secret weapon was about to cease being invisible. Dawn arrived wrapped in a thin mist, muffling sound and distance. On the field, men adjusted armor, tightened reins, and waited in absolute silence. Every breath felt too loud. Ahead, the enemy remained fixated on the siege, unaware that the real battle would not come from the walls, but from the hills dominating the valley. The first movements were subtle. Allied units advanced just enough to draw attention, forcing the enemy to react. Troops were redeployed, reserves committed, formations stretched beyond their ideal limits. Everything unfolded as planned. Each enemy response confirmed that the trap was closing slowly, without haste or direct confrontation. From elevated ground, commanders watched the field like patient hunters. Nothing was improvised. Troop positions, reinforcement flows, and even wind direction were taken into account. This would not be a conventional attack. It would be a concentrated impact, designed to break not only defensive lines, but the enemy's very ability to respond. The mistake became clear when the attacking army definitively split its forces. One part continued pressing the city, another attempted to contain the external threat. On paper, it looked like control. In reality, it was exposed weakness. Neither side was strong enough to withstand a decisive blow. Numerical superiority began to dissolve across the terrain. The waiting continued for hours. Fighting already raged in secondary sectors, yet the decisive force remained still. Horses shifted restlessly, hooves striking the ground, restrained with effort. The men understood that this delay was not hesitation. It was calculation. The timing had to ensure that once unleashed, nothing could stop them. When the signal was finally given, there were no speeches and no horns, only movement. A compact mass began to descend the slope, gaining speed with every meter. The terrain did its work, transforming weight and discipline into destructive force. The initial silence gave way to a deep, growing roar that could not be ignored. The enemy realized it too late. What approached was not a common charge, but an organized avalanche. Formations tried to adjust in haste. Orders were shouted. Banners shifted position. Nothing was enough. The psychological impact came first. Lines began to waver even before the physical collision. When contact occurred, it was brutal. Speed, mass, and coordination tore through defenses as if they did not exist. Soldiers were thrown to the ground. Formations shattered, and the center began to collapse rapidly. There was no time to reorganize. The attack did not push forward. It cut through, leaving destruction in its wake. Within minutes, the effect spread across the entire field. Units still intact panicked when they saw collapse beside them. Orders vanished, retreat routes clogged, and discipline evaporated. The army that had advanced with confidence now fought only to escape. The battle had changed its nature completely. The siege ended there, not through negotiation or slow attrition, but through sudden destruction. What had seemed an inevitable victory turned into absolute defeat. The secret weapon was not only the force unleashed, but the moment chosen. In a matter of hours, history was reversed, and nothing that followed could undo that instant. After the initial impact, the battlefield descended into irreversible chaos. What remained was not organized resistance, but men running without direction, abandoning weapons and banners. Defeat was no longer merely military, it became psychological. In a single afternoon, confidence built over decades dissolved before everyone's eyes. Retreat routes turned into traps. Congested bridges, narrow paths, and riverbanks became scenes of desperation. Many never looked back. Survival instinct replaced discipline. An entire army ceased to exist, not through total annihilation, but through the complete loss of cohesion and command. Inside Vienna, the sounds of battle brought an unexpected realization. The steady thunder faded into distant confusion. Soon, clear signs of collapse appeared. Gates were opened, troops poured out, and enemy flanks were struck. The siege that had suffocated the city for months unraveled in mere hours. Civilians emerged among ruins and smoke, witnessing what had seemed impossible days before. This was not just a military victory, but the interruption of an accepted fate. The city transformed from a symbol of impending destruction into one of resistance and historical reversal. The psychological impact spread far beyond its walls. For the defeated empire, consequences were immediate and severe. Leaders were held accountable, punishments imposed, explanations demanded. More damaging than the loss of men was the destruction of the myth of invincibility. Peoples once resigned to submission began to see resistance as a real alternative. For the victors, glory came with clarity. It was evident that success was not born of luck or isolated bravery. It came from patient preparation, correct reading of the terrain, and the decision to wait. The secret weapon revealed itself as something deeper, the ability to transform opportunity into a final blow. The battle also marked the end of an era. That form of force, used perfectly in that specific context, reached its historical peak. Warfare would soon change, demanding new methods and technologies. Still, the event would endure as the ultimate example of applying a capability at exactly the right moment. Over time, the event moved beyond military records into symbolism. Accounts, paintings, and stories turned the day into legend. Yet behind the heroic imagery lay a cold and precise logic. No single element would have sufficed alone. It was the perfect convergence that produced the outcome. The greatest lesson lies not in the violence, but in timing. Acting too early would have wasted the advantage. Acting too late would have sealed defeat. History shows that in critical moments, time can be more decisive than numbers or brute force. Whoever controls timing controls the outcome. Thus, the destruction of that army was neither accident nor exaggeration. It was the direct result of superior decisions. The battlefield merely revealed what strategy had already determined. The secret weapon was visible in impact, but invisible throughout preparation. That is what changed history that day. The consequences of that defeat echoed far beyond the battlefield. Within weeks, the balance of power in Central Europe began to shift. Cities once resigned to submission found courage to resist. Alliances were reconsidered. An advance once thought unstoppable now faced clear limits. A single day was enough to reorder decades of fear. From that moment on, strategic initiative changed hands. The defeated empire was forced to retreat, defend neglected frontiers, and abandon long-held ambitions. What began as a campaign of absolute confidence ended as a historic turning point. It was not an isolated loss, but the beginning of a decline that could never be fully reversed. For the victors, glory was immediate, but not without cost. Resources were exhausted, forces depleted, and political rewards often fell short of expectations. History rarely distributes outcomes evenly. Even so, in that specific moment, the victory represented the pinnacle of a way of thinking and conducting war with near-perfect precision. As years passed, new weapons and doctrines reduced the effectiveness of that decisive force. Warfare evolved, and what once determined battles assumed a secondary role. Yet the episode never lost relevance. It endured not through nostalgia, but through the clarity of its strategic lessons, which remain applicable in any era. This distinction separates legend from true learning. The value of that day lies not in spectacle alone, but in the logic that made victory possible. Identifying the decisive factor, preserving it from premature use, and unleashing it at the precise moment requires rare discipline. Many possess power, few know when to use it. The fatal error of the defeated side was common and recurring in history: overconfidence. Victory seemed guaranteed, and caution faded. Dividing forces, underestimating terrain, and ignoring time transformed advantage into vulnerability. The defeat was shaped long before the final clash ever occurred. That is why the episode continues to be studied not as a historical curiosity, but as a practical lesson. Decisive battles are not improvised. They are built quietly through patience, observation, and the courage to wait. When the secret weapon was finally unleashed, the outcome had already been prepared. More than a physical triumph, it was an intellectual victory. The ability to see beyond the immediate, resist pressure for quick action, and trust a well-constructed plan separated collapse from historic reversal. In complex situations, this skill remains the greatest dividing line between failure and lasting success. Viewed today, it becomes clear that the true secret never resided solely in soldiers or equipment. It existed in the precise combination of preparation, contextual understanding, and decision-making at the right moment. This logic transcends warfare and applies wherever limited resources must create maximum impact. When circumstances appear overwhelmingly unfavorable, instinct urges immediate action. The story of Vienna proves the opposite. Waiting, structuring, and choosing the correct moment can be more powerful than any reckless assault. The secret weapon was not only visible on the field, but invisible throughout preparation. Texto padrone. That is why this episode remains relevant centuries later. It speaks to decision-making under extreme pressure, to how accumulated errors produce catastrophic defeat, and to how great victories are rarely accidents. They are the result of conscious choices made when few possess the clarity to make them. The siege, once destined for success, became a landmark of strategic failure, not due to lack of strength, but excess confidence. The secret weapon did not appear suddenly. It was preserved, protected, and released when it could no longer be contained. This was the essence of the historic reversal. In the end, what endured was not only the memory of a decisive battle, but confirmation of a timeless principle. Power without direction is fragile. Force, applied with precision, even when smaller, can reshape entire destinies. That balance altered history before the walls of Vienna. Understanding this dynamic allows us to see beyond surface events. The destruction of the Ottoman army was the direct result of superior strategic decisions. Nothing there was accidental. Preparation, patience, and flawless execution transformed a critical moment into a point of no return for two worlds in collision. If this story expanded your understanding of strategy, warfare, and decisive moments, leave your comment below. Like the video to support the channel, follow for more historical narratives, and activate notifications. Here, every story reveals lessons that continue to shape the world today. Texto padrone.